Is it possible for a couple to do IVF in a 100% ethical, moral way?
In my opinion, no.
Are only non-viable embryos what are being destroyed in the IVF process?
No. Many healthy, viable embryos are being destroyed in the IVF process. A petri dish is not a perfectly conducive environment for human life, and no one ever asked their permission to do this.
You are one of the most credentialed doctors I've ever had on the show. You are also probably the most controversial.
Bad things happen when good people fail to speak out.
Dr. Kheriaty is a physician specializing in psychiatry with a focus on bioethics surrounding reproductive technology. In this interview, he will present scientific and evidence-based arguments against fertility treatments like IVF, perspectives you may have not heard before. The goal is to gently encourage you to consider another viewpoint on the ethical issues surrounding these practices. While every baby is a blessing, regardless of how they were conceived, Dr. Kheriaty invites you to consider that not all methods of conception are ethically sound or free from consequences. The desire for a child is natural, but it's important to recognize that some fertility treatments, such as IVF, can bring with them ethical dilemmas that are often overlooked. Dr. Kheriaty does not seek to condemn those who pursue these treatments at all, and neither do I, but rather to foster a conversation about the moral implications of these practices. This interview aims to provide a thought-provoking perspective, urging you to reflect deeply on the decisions surrounding reproductive technologies and their broader societal impact. We also get into some new reproductive technologies that may become available to us in as little as 10 years, which should gravely concern you. Dr. Kheriaty is the author of 3 books, including most recently, The New Abnormal: The Rise of the Biomedical Security State. He is a fellow and director of the program in Bioethics and American Democracy at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He's also a plaintiff in the landmark free speech case, Missouri versus Biden, challenging government censorship on social media. His work has been published in everything from the Wall Street Journal to the Washington Post and is frequently seen on NBC, CBS, CNN, Fox, and NPR. Culture Apothecary is a beautifully shot multi-camera show available to view on YouTube if you subscribe to Real Alex Clark, or you can watch on Spotify. Our goal is to heal a sick culture, physically, emotionally, and spiritually, with expert guests twice a week on a myriad of countercultural issues on everything from parenting to ultra-processed food. This show is free, but you can support us by leaving a 5-star review wherever you listen, or take it a step further by making a tax-deductible donation through the link in the description. I'm Alex Clark. Please welcome Dr. Kheriaty to Culture Apothecary. You are one of the most credentialed doctors I've ever had on the show. First of all, you are also probably the most controversial. And in this interview, what I really want to focus on are the ethical and moral question marks, if you will, surrounding reproductive technology and fertility treatments that we are familiar with and that we use. And then I want to get into kind of some upcoming technology that people likely haven't heard of yet in my audience and what should really be a cause for concern. So what I want to start with is this widely held belief that all technology is good, that new advancements in technology are always a good thing because as humans, we're just evolving and learning new things.
Thank you for that. And I'll wear that as a badge of honor that I'm the most controversial doctor that you've had on the show. Yeah, this notion that technology is automatically good and that it's automatically going to take us in the direction of progress. I think anyone who's familiar with the history of, let's say, the last 100 years should be able to look at that notion and recognize that this is kind of actually the devil's doctrine, that if we can do something, we should do it. I mean, take nuclear technology, for example. It can be used for good purposes to generate energy. Even that is controversial. What do you do with the waste that's generated? Or it can be used to make a bomb that kills literally millions of people. So technology itself is not automatically going to lead us to progress toward health and human flourishing. And especially when it comes to medical technology and biomedical technologies, we have to think carefully about how they're being used. They can be used for the purpose of health and healing, and that's a good thing. they can also be used in ways that unfortunately can become dehumanizing. Many people these days, the so-called transhumanists, for example, propose to use science and technology not just to take sick people and make them well, not just using technology for the traditional purpose of medicine, which is healing and health, but taking healthy people and making them, quote unquote, better than well, bigger, faster, stronger, smarter. Wouldn't it be a great thing if we could give you a pill or, a drug that would improve your concentration and improve your attention, or make it so that you never needed to sleep, or take a short person and make them tall, or take a slow person and make them fast? And based on our experience so far with these kinds of technologies, we recognize that actually when we start deviating from the purposes of medicine, always and only hopefully aim toward health and healing, and try to use technology for these other purposes, instead of actually making people healthier and happier, and instead of leading toward human flourishing, we end up having all kinds of negative downstream consequences that people didn't think about when they set off on these kind of utopian Promethean projects.
Why were you intrigued as a doctor in the ethics surrounding reproductive technology? Like, were you working in pediatrics? Like, why this topic?
So when I was at the University of California, I did chair the ethics committee. And so we got ethics consults from all the various departments in the hospital, including consults of complicated cases from obstetrics, maternal fetal medicine cases where you had a complicated pregnancy, difficult issues that were wrapped up in that. So, for example, I remember being consulted on a surrogacy case. There was a couple from abroad that had come and hired a gestational surrogate in California, someone basically to carry their baby for them during the 9 months of pregnancy. And surrogacy is one of those issues at the beginning of life where there's all kinds of complicated ethical problems associated with it that many people don't think about when they set off on these projects. And what happened in this case basically was the surrogate got pregnant with twins, which is very frequent because they use IVF. Oftentimes they will implant more than one embryo to try to increase their odds of achieving a viable pregnancy. And when you do that, your chances of getting twins or triplets goes up considerably. In this case, the surrogate conceived twins. And it turns out that one of the twins, based on prenatal genetic testing, likely had some kind of heart condition. It wasn't a fatal heart condition. It was a heart condition that required cardiac surgery immediately after birth that probably would have led to a normal, more or less healthy life. But the intentional parents who had hired this surrogate did not want a baby that had any sort of medical condition. So they tried to force the surrogate to have an abortion of the one member of the twin pair that had the heart condition. And the surrogate did not want to have an abortion. She was morally opposed to that. And so we had this conflict. And we also had a difficult situation in that basically these intentional parents were going to abandon, I'll call him baby B after he was born, the baby with the heart condition. And we had no disposition. We had no family for that baby. So we had to get involved in basically a complicated process of finding adoptive parents for this child who had been abandoned by the intentional parents.
The state ended up siding them with the surrogate, the woman?
The state didn't get involved because the parents were actually from abroad, which is common in California. California, well, the United States in general, but California in particular, is sort of the Wild West of surrogacy. When the state or the law gets involved, it becomes even more complicated because the law very often doesn't know what to do with these kinds of cases. So we did get the social services agency involved that helped basically to arrange an adoption, but it was kind of up to the ethics committee to navigate the issues of basically how do we, first of all, get someone to consent for this baby to have cardiac surgery after it was born, because during the pregnancy, the surrogate mother, the woman carrying the twins, had the right to consent for interventions. But immediately after giving birth, based on the surrogacy contract, she had no more parental rights over the parents. Those were given over to these intentional parents. The intentional parents then abandoned baby B, and baby B essentially became temporarily a ward of the state. So yeah, that's one example among many that I could cite.
That you were just working with at the University of California, is that what you said?
Yeah, that's right.
That you would come across your desk and you would look at and you were like, this is interesting. Like this whole field of reproductive technology and fertility and all of that, like surrogacy, IVF, it piqued your interest.
Yeah, and it piqued my interest even earlier. I mean, I started studying bioethics and philosophy as an undergraduate, and already at that time, these ethical issues at the beginning of life, sort of life at the extremes, at the very beginning of life and at the end of life, piqued my curiosity because they raise so many profound issues about human life itself, about what does it mean to be human, what does it mean in these stages to be dependent on others, and how do we care for those who are most vulnerable, especially those who can't speak for themselves? So I've had a longstanding interest in these issues.
What is wrong with having human beings grade certain types of embryos for problems? Why wouldn't we want to choose human embryos that are going to have the best outcome possible?
So yeah, you're referring to pre-implantation genetic testing, which is often done in conjunction with IVF, which is basically create new human life, a new embryo in the laboratory, test it for various genetic conditions, and then take only the ones that we deem to be genetically most fit and implant them in a uterus to try to bring them to birth. And with the others, we simply discard them. We kill them because they're deemed unfit or less than optimized. And I think there's many problems with this. One is that it revives old attitudes that were prominent in the early 20th century in the so-called eugenics movement. And when you say the word eugenics, most people think of the Nazis, the fact that the Nazis killed and euthanized people with disabilities, which is widely known now. People who were mentally ill or had physical disabilities were taken to hospitals, and against their will, they were basically killed by Nazi doctors. But what many people don't realize is that the eugenics movement did not begin in the 20th century in Germany. It began in the United States and Great Britain, where people who were deemed genetically unfit were involuntarily sterilized. So 27 of the 50 states in the US had laws in the 20th century permitting men or women who were mentally ill, or in many cases just impoverished at the margins of society. They didn't really have a diagnosable physical or mental condition, but they were deemed to have a propensity to criminality or promiscuity or whatever. So they were basically involuntarily sterilized.
Who was behind that movement in the United States?
Well, many key foundations in the United States, it was very mainstream. So the Carnegie Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation were supportive of this. Margaret Sanger and the early Planned Parenthood movement was deeply involved in this. And many prominent politicians from FDR to others were basically supportive of eugenics. It was sort of seen as part of mainstream progressivism. And it got a bad name after World War II, rightly so. Eugenics sort of went underground. But what's happening now with pre-implantation genetic testing is that those same discriminatory attitudes are basically kind of being revived in our attitude toward the creation of new human life, right? And we take human life that should be received as a gift and as something of a surprise, if you will. When that baby is born, we don't know exactly what it's going to look like. And we're going to welcome it into the world, even if it's sick, even if it requires medical care, even if he or she is disabled in some way. But if you start trying to control that process at the beginning of life using the means that you just described, basically you take the reception of new human life as a gift and you turn it into a project of our own creation. It becomes a kind of quality control manufacturing process where the person has to be made according to our exact specifications. And if they turn out to not meet those specifications, they're seen as less than, right? So this can be used for sex discrimination, basically. People from certain cultures that value boys over girls will use it to basically ensure that they don't have a baby girl, which reinforces those sex stereotypes and those discriminatory attitudes towards one or another gender. This can be used to discriminate against people with disability and illness as well. But now there are companies actually offering services, not just to try to eliminate genetic diseases. And actually, you're not, it's worth noting that you're not using this to actually treat genetic diseases. You're simply eliminating those people who have genetic diseases.
That's a really good point.
It's sometimes framed as a treatment.
Yeah.
No, treatment is taking a sick or an afflicted individual and doing something to make them healthier, right? To try to cure that illness. That's a good thing. We should be using these technologies for that kind of purpose. But what you're describing here with pre-implantation genetic testing and discarding of embryos is not actually treating anyone. It's simply killing those human beings in their earliest stage of development who are deemed not to meet our exact quality control, quote unquote, specifications. The danger is, the eugenics of the past was sort of state-sponsored and top-down and coercive. The new eugenics isn't necessarily coercive, but that's not the only problem that was associated with eugenics. The other problem that's associated with it is it basically takes our attitude toward other people and shifts it in ways that can disvalue certain classes of individuals. It actually changes our attitude toward those people who are living and walking among us, who are afflicted with the conditions that we deemed basically unfit for, for life and for the opportunity to grow and develop and come into the world.
When you were talking about discarding embryos, you used the word. Now, that might be controversial for some people or confusing for some people. Why would sex selection or discarding embryos be considered a human being?
Sure. Well, an embryo is simply a human being, a fully formed, genetically complete human organism in its earliest stage of development. It's not a different kind of entity than you and I. You and I were once embryos in the earliest moments of our life, in the earliest moments of our existence. So the word embryo does not designate a different type of entity. It designates a stage of human development. The same thing with the word fetus. That's just a later stage of prenatal development, just like newborn or infant or
teenager,
toddler or teenager or elderly designates another stage of development. So it is because clearly this is a living human being that has the functions of a living human being at that early stage of development. It may not look to the naked eye like a human being, but that is simply what a human being looks like at that early stage of development. And we can know a lot about that human being. That's why we do prenatal genetic testing in some cases, because it can actually show us a lot about that human being. And those genes are the same through all stages of development. So I use that word because it's even if it is ethically controversial, it's the most accurate description of what happens when you take a living organism, in this case, a member of the species Homo sapiens, a human being, and you throw it in the trash basket, right? Which is essentially what happens in those cases.
Most pancake mixes at the store are either gross, super unhealthy, or both. Well, I've got a little secret to make your mornings a lot easier, and that is the Taylor Duke's Wellness Organic Protein Pancake Mix. Typically, those protein pancake mixes at the store are filled with fake ingredients, preservatives, a lot of sugar. People don't think about that. But Taylor Duke's Organic Protein Pancake Mix is made with simple organic ingredients. No dairy, no gluten, no soy, and it's packed with clean protein to keep you full and energized all morning long. I'm talking about fluffy, delicious pancakes that don't make you feel guilty. Plus, you get all the benefits of protein, which helps with energy, muscle support, and just setting up your day right. Your kids are actually gonna like these, and you can use it for waffles too. And the best part, you can whip these up in no time. No more stressing about what to make for breakfast. You can add chocolate chips or berries or whatever you want to make it a little extra special. Just mix it up, pour it on the griddle, and you've got a meal that's both tasty and good for you. So if you're tired of all the unhealthy options when it comes to pancake mixes and you wanna try something new, go to TaylorDukesWellness.com and grab the Organic Protein Pancake Mix. Breakfast doesn't have to be boring to be healthy. That's TaylorDukesWellness.com. Code Alex Clark is gonna get you 10% off. TaylorDukesWellness.com, code Alex Clark for 10% off. Getting rid of seed oils doesn't mean that I can't still enjoy a good chip or salty snack. I mean, I'm a total sucker for crunchy snacks. I've tried every brand out there, and for a while, I was stuck with the usual options that left me feeling, kind of gross after a handful. Oily, sluggish, this aftertaste that makes you question your life choices. Well, then I found Masa chips, and it was like somebody handed me the holy grail of chips. Seriously, no seed oils, just clean, real ingredients that actually taste amazing. Masa chips are made with only 3 things: nixtamalized organic corn, grass-fed beef tallow, and Redmond sea salt. That's it. No fillers, no artificial stuff, no junk, just real food that tastes so much better than anything I've tried before. They're super crunchy, they don't break in your guac, which is a huge deal, and they don't leave you feeling sluggish. It's like eating chips that your body actually thanks you for instead of making you feel like you need a nap after every bite. And Masa chips don't have any weird chemicals or preservatives, just pure crunchy joy in every bite. So if you're ready to ditch the seed oils and snack like a pro, Masa chips are calling your name. Use my code RealAlexClark for 20% off your first order at masachips.com. That's RealAlexClark for 20% off, masachips.com. What are some concerning differences about the way that America does IVF versus other countries?
IVF in the United States is very unregulated. And the laws in different countries vary, but most countries have stricter laws, for example, about how many embryos you can implant in a uterus at one time. You may not remember, might have been a little bit before your time, but there was a case not too long ago in California of a woman who gave birth to 8 babies, the so-called octomom.
Oh, sure,
right?
yes, I know her.
This was not naturally conceived. This was a rogue IVF physician who decided he was going to implant 8 embryos, and all 8 of them, which is rather unusual if you were to do that, all 8 of them actually achieved a viable pregnancy. There's no laws or regulations about the age of the mother with IVF, for example. So you have elderly women bringing children into the world, genetically related children into the world through IVF, intending to be their mothers, but not living long enough to see their children attain high school, which was entirely foreseeable given their stage of life. I mean, there's a reason why the body naturally goes into menopause, for example, at a certain age, because in order to care for children that you might conceive using your gametes, using the eggs in your body, you should be hopefully at an age where the odds statistically are likely that you will be able to raise that child to adulthood.
Sure.
So, I mean, other examples could be multiplied, but essentially you have an industry that is very, very profitable, that does not want any regulation and oversight, that wants to operate basically on the principle of maximizing profitability.
And are there also rules in other countries about embryos being on ice?
There are some places that try to do a better job of basically putting fewer embryos or limiting the number of embryos that can be put in on ice, as you said, in cryopreservation. So essentially, if you don't quickly implant an embryo, it will die unless it's put into cold storage, which is essentially what happens in many IVF clinics. And one of the consequences of a sort of Wild West, unregulated IVF industry in the United States is that no one knows the number for sure, but reasonable estimates are that there are anywhere between 500,000 and several million embryos right now in cold storage on ice in a suspended state of animation. And we now know that you can thaw out an embryo and implant it later, in some cases a decade or 2 after it has been frozen, which leads to all kinds of strange possibilities. You could have 2 twins, for example, that were created via IVF at the same time. One of them is implanted, one of them is frozen for 20 years and then implanted. You have 2 twins that essentially were conceived at the same time, but whose developmental age now is 20 years apart.
So why does that matter to you?
First of all, no one knows what to do with these frozen embryos. And there's legal battles around these frozen embryos. The actress Sofia Vergara and her ex-boyfriend Nick Loeb have been in a fight over what to do with the disposition of their embryos after the breakup of their relationship. That's been a legal battle that's been actually going on for many years. Do we treat these embryos as property, which is what most states do? Well, in that case, in the case of a divorce or a breakup, how do you can divide up material assets, reasonably well in a situation like that. You cannot divide up embryos in a situation like that. And if there's a difference about what to do with those embryos, that creates legal conflicts. Many of the parents don't want those embryos to be destroyed. They feel morally conflicted or ambivalent about that because let's say they created 6 embryos with IVF and they brought 3 of those to birth and they have 3 in cold storage. Well, they know what those embryos are. They know that if you put them in the conducive environment of the womb, this is what they become. They are, in fact, our children in their earliest stage of development. So they feel conflicted about simply destroying them. They feel conflicted about donating them to science for research or adopting them out to another couple that might bring them to birth because they don't want their own genetically related offspring being raised by another family. So they don't know what to do. The clinics don't know what to do with these frozen embryos. And we're stuck in this kind of limbo where there seems to be no just resolution to this conundrum. So it's a very serious problem that most people who are advocates of IVF would prefer not to think about and prefer simply to ignore. Most intentional parents that go into IVF do so with the best of intentions. Obviously, they want to have a child. And whenever possible, they want to have a child that's genetically related to them, which is a good and beautiful thing. And they're often kind of advised that, there may be this question about what to do with the spare embryos later, but they're so focused on what they want, which is their child or their 2 or 3 children or whatever their plans are, that if and when they get that, it's only then that they start thinking deeply about, okay, what are the issues that were raised by creating these so-called excess embryos that we now don't know what to do with.
Is it possible for a couple to do IVF in a 100% ethical, moral way?
In my opinion, no. And I understand that that's going to be a controversial opinion among many people in our audience. But I think essentially when you start creating human life in the laboratory, when you start involving a third party in a process that should be essentially the human life coming into being as the result of the union of the mother and the father, and hopefully a loving, stable union that's able to provide a familial context for that child. When you start separating those things out and you start bringing in a third party who engages in a kind of manufacturing process, you have already in subtle ways instrumentalized that new human life. You've begun to treat a someone as a something. Even if you don't create excess embryos, even if you implant and attempt to give the opportunity for continued life to all the embryos you create, that is I think, more ethically acceptable way to approach IVF. Even then, there are all kinds of unforeseen consequences to this process that I think undermine, the possibility that basically that this is ethical. I mean, one of the things that we're discovering now is that IVF was essentially an unconsented experiment on the child, right? We didn't really know, would this cause more medical problems for children? We now know that it does, right? There is evidence that children born of IVF have higher rates of certain chronic medical conditions than the general population.
Like what?
There's evidence, for example, for metabolic syndrome. There is some evidence, although this is controversial and we need more research, there's some evidence of higher rates of autism and other developmental disorders among children who are conceived via IVF, probably because the laboratory is not a perfectly conducive environment. A petri dish is not a perfectly conducive environment for human life. We also don't know the effects of long-term cold storage, cryopreservation on new human life. So we're essentially engaged when we embarked on the whole project of IVF, the unknown number of embryos that were killed before the first successful case of an IVF birth in 1978, we're essentially engaged in an unconsented experiment on individuals who we now know probably are adversely impacted in terms of their health. And no one ever asked their permission to do this or to bring them into the world in this way.
What is your opinion on the ethics of a couple who has an excess amount of embryos? They decide to implant several, they have several kids, but with the extras, they put them up for adoption to be raised by other families.
I'm of two minds on this issue. I'm sort of divided, and I'm still actually wrestling with this notion of embryo adoption. On the one hand, it seems like the humane thing to do for an embryo in cold storage to give it the opportunity of life. On the other hand, there are some complicated ethical issues associated with embryo adoption as well. And so I don't think it is the solution to make IVF ethical. I mean, first of all, there are not enough interested adoptive parents that are willing to go through this process in order to handle the millions of embryos that are awaiting life in cold storage. Can we save some of them through embryo adoption? Perhaps. Would that be a good thing? perhaps, although it's not without its own set of kind of ethical difficulties. So on the one hand, I'm sympathetic to people that want to do that. It does show some respect and regard for the
Sure.
value of human life. But on the other hand, I don't think that is the solution to sort of take the problems associated with IVF and, propose this is the way to fix them.
I guess for me, what kind of stands out in that type of scenario is that those children who are adopted out as embryos to another family, they're obviously going to grow up and find out about how they were conceived.
Yeah.
And they're going to know that they have siblings out there that
That's
got to
right.
stay with mom and dad and that they didn't. And then what would that create for that child as far as their sense of identity and sense of belonging and worthiness and love? That is what scares me about that scenario personally.
Yeah, there's a notion in psychology that was coined a couple of decades ago, but it is really applicable to these situations with assisted reproductive technologies. And it's this idea of what's called genealogical bewilderment, that as these kids grow up, especially as they get into adolescence and young adulthood, what we're discovering is this desire to know not just my adoptive parents, if you will, my intentional parents who raised me, but to know my genetic lineage as an intrinsic, constitutive part of my identity. And, in obvious ways, you could see how, well, people would want to know, do I have a family history of heart disease or cancer or something like that I should be worried about? So it's often framed in those terms, but actually, if you dig into what's happening psychologically with these children, it goes much deeper than just wanting to know my family medical history or wanting to know my family mental health history or something like that. It's really wanting to know my origins. And like you said, you framed it very well with your question. I probably have genetically related siblings out there that I don't know, that I've never met. My parents sort of chose those ones to bring into their family and to raise, and they let me go, or did they reject me, or was it a loving thing to actually adopt me? So these issues are, granted, also found in cases of adoption. But the difference between adoption and assisted reproductive technologies is adoption is I think a morally praiseworthy and ethically good thing because it takes a bad scenario, a suboptimal scenario, and tries to make the best out of it, right?
Right.
You have biological parents that are, for whatever reason, incapable, unable to raise their own children. And so, yes, the loving thing in that case is to try to find another family for them and to make the best of it. And even then, we know that adoptive children deal with some of these identity issues very commonly, and this desire to know their biological parents. But what happens in assisted reproductive technologies is not, there's a kind of a tragic situation that developed unintentionally that we're trying to make the best out of, as with adoption. But we're actually setting out in advance to create this scenario as though it's an acceptable way of going about making children. And I think that's the key distinction between encountering these issues in the context of adoption, where no one set out to kind of create this scenario on purpose, and assisted reproductive technologies, where we know in advance we're going to create these kinds of scenarios and create these kinds of problems for children.
Last Saturday, my grandma was landscaping under a blazing spring sun. Hours later, her arms were lobster red with sunburn. I told her, order some active skin repair. A lot of wound ointments are not non-toxic and might actually do more harm than good. Active skin repair uses hypochlorous acid, or HOCI, a natural molecule mimicking your immune system to cleanse, calm inflammation, heal burns, scrapes, even acne, and yes, sunburn. Pick the spray for a light mist or hydrogel for thicker coverage. Both are non-toxic, safe for all skin types, ages, even pets, babies, clinically proven to support recovery. Over 500,000 happy customers. Runner's World features HSA eligibility. Active skin repair is not only pregnancy safe, but safe on infants too. New moms love it for tricky diaper rashes. Forget Neosporin synthetic mess. Visit ActiveSkinRepair.com. Use code ALEX for 20% off. And let your skin mend naturally. Backed by science. That's ActiveSkinRepair.com, code ALEX for 20% off. There's a lot of confusion about colostrum versus collagen, two completely different things that have different benefits for the body. I take both every day. Colostrum is like collagen's cooler older brother. They're both fantastic, but while collagen is mainly focused on hair and skin, cowboy colostrum has other benefits as well. Colostrum is packed with all-natural proteins, growth factors, and immunoglobulins, and those little powerhouses work together to do things like boost immunity, balance gut health, and seal leaky gut, also help reduce inflammation. Oh, and it's got antimicrobial peptides that literally erase harmful bacteria from your gut, like a cleaning crew in a germy hotel. It's also got this rich, creamy texture that will take your coffee or smoothie to the next level. So whether you like unflavored cowboy colostrum, vanilla, or chocolate, cowboy colostrum has you covered. If you want your body to function like a high-performance machine and not like that rusty old toaster in your kitchen, you need cowboy colostrum. Head over to cowboycolostrum.com, use code ALEX to get 25% off your first order. That's 25% off your first order at cowboycolostrum.com with code ALEX. Do you believe that the practice of IVF should be banned entirely, or is there a way to reform it to avoid this moral quandary?
So, I mean, I think it's important to talk about like what's politically feasible, and, a total ban on IVF in the United States, I don't see as something politically feasible. So I don't think that's worth talking about from a policy perspective because, even if it would resolve these issues, I think it's not politically realistic just given the current political climate. So as a provisional measure, what I would like to see is better regulation of the industry, more data on what is going on with this industry, because IVF clinics are basically not required to report virtually any data to the CDC or to public health agencies other than basically their success rates in achieving pregnancy. And even then, the enforcement mechanism for data reporting is very, very, very weak in federal and state laws. So like it's a good provisional first step that I think people on both sides of these debates and both sides of these issues could hopefully get on board with, and therefore would be potentially politically feasible, is let's get some sensible reporting requirements in place so that, for example, we could track the health of these children across the lifespan. Like that would be a good place to start, right? So that we can track and try to minimize at least some of the worst abuses that are happening in IVF clinics, taking advantage of parents who are very often in a vulnerable scenario because they're desperate to have children. I mean, one thing that when we're talking about this issue that I think is very important to acknowledge, especially, people who are on the other side of this debate. I mean, many of our listeners were probably conceived by IVF. Many of our listeners probably have undergone IVF themselves in order to achieve pregnancy and have children. Their children are, of course, a beautiful thing. It's just acknowledging the pain of infertility, right? The reason this industry is so successful and powerful and financially lucrative is because 1 in 6 couples is struggling with infertility. And many of my colleagues at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and elsewhere are trying to refocus our attention on what they call restorative reproductive medicine, which is let's not look at IVF as the only solution, right? So, okay, maybe we're not going to do away with IVF, but maybe we could take a both and approach and say, rather than just jumping straight to IVF as kind of the first thing that's offered to couples having difficulty conceiving, who are obviously in a very painful and anguishing circumstance if they want to have a child, why don't we put more resources in science and medicine toward trying to understand, diagnose, and correct the underlying causes of infertility? I think that's something your audience can readily grasp.
100%.
Right? Because you've drilled down on your show on many of the problems associated with our contemporary healthcare practices, and sort of patching up problems with Band-Aids. In a sense, IVF doesn't treat infertility. It simply doesn't end run around infertility. A treatment for infertility would be whether the man or the woman is the source of the problem with difficulty conceiving. What can we do to correct that underlying problem so that they can conceive a child the natural way, the old-fashioned way, the much more fun, less invasive and intrusive way? So I would be an advocate. I think a realistic program that people on both sides of this debate could get behind is let's get some sensible regulation around IVF, and let's put more resources into restorative reproductive medicine and help people understand that maybe IVF isn't your only option. Maybe there's some other ways that medicine and that good, healthcare practices can help you achieve what you want to achieve, which should obviously be a good and beautiful thing to have children.
Is there a class injustice in how we approach infertility?
Absolutely. I mean, IVF, one of the dirty little secrets of the industry is that it caters to people who can pay for it, right? Very often not covered by insurance. People are paying minimum $15,000 per cycle, sometimes having to go through multiple cycles.
So when I hear you say that, we talked about the eugenics in gender
Yeah.
selection and disabilities and all those types of things. But there could be almost a sneaky underlying form of eugenics in that really only certain classes of families who can afford this
That's right.
technology can reproduce, and that people who are in poverty cannot afford this technology, they're not reproducing.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that. Basically IVF is offered to people that can pay for it, and the genetic testing that often goes hand in hand with IVF, which is used not just for sex selection and not just to try to eliminate genetic diseases, but many companies are pitching it now to try to, we can't do this perfectly given the complexities of genetics, but to try to increase your odds of getting the kind of desirable traits that you want. These are services that are offered to the wealthy. So I think there is a form of class discrimination when it comes to these assisted reproductive technologies. I mean, the other example of this is that the women who are being used as surrogates, right? The woman who carries a child inside of her for 9 months and then goes through labor and gives birth to that child and is, according to the surrogacy contract, never even allowed to touch that child after she gives birth to it. I mean, can you imagine going through labor
No.
and hearing that baby crying and then never seeing or touching that baby again? We know that there's a lot of bonding that happens during pregnancy. We know that the child turns preferentially to the pregnant mother's voice because it learns the voice as an unborn child. It learns that voice because to bond to that mother in very, very profound ways that we barely understand. We're severing that bond with a surrogate and putting her through the risks of pregnancy, and in some cases exploiting her in other ways. And the women who do that do it usually for money, right? So again, they're going to come from a class of women who are economically more vulnerable and therefore would sell their body in this way to be used in this way, typically to a wealthy couple that does it, maybe for medical reasons, but sometimes just simply for reasons of convenience because, I don't want to go through the ordeal of pregnancy myself, so I'm going to hire someone else to do it. So you see all kinds of interesting class-based issues around justice and equality when it comes to something like surrogacy as well. That again is one of those kind of issues that's swept under the carpet when people focus only on the outcome of people getting what they want.
Sure. And I also think, a lot of people hear that like, okay, yes, that's sad. A baby, in the womb is bonding with that surrogate mother and their voice and all that. But they're a newborn baby. They're going to forget that in a couple weeks and then they're going to be in a loving home. And so why does that really matter?
Well, it's disruptive to their development, actually. And so this kind of attitude, one of the things that troubles me about the kind of casual way that people think about these technologies and think about these issues is the kind of easy, casual, dismissive way in which any harms or potential harms to the child sort of get waved away in exactly that fashion that you just illustrated with your question. And I actually find that very troubling because when you talk about a situation where children are involved, actually prioritizing the needs of the grown-ups is exactly the opposite of what a sane and humane and healthy society does.
Yes.
Right? A sane society does not instrumentalize children to gratify the needs of parents.
Yes.
Right? Parents act in a self-sacrificing way, inconveniencing themselves, doing everything they can to minimize harms to children. But somehow with assisted reproductive technologies, and I think, again, going back to what I said earlier about the way in which the process itself and the technologies themselves subtly instrumentalize the child, turn it into a product to be manufactured, right? Rather than a gift to be welcomed. That then leads, I think, and encourages this kind of casual dismissive attitude. Well, yeah, I mean, What if it turns out that these kids have higher rates of health problems, or they have attachment difficulties because they were ripped away from their gestational mother at birth, right? At least they exist, right? At least they're here. The alternative is they wouldn't exist in the first place. Well, I find that attitude actually troublingly callous and a kind of reversal of roles where the job of the grown-ups in the room is to put the needs of the children first. And somehow with these technologies, we've decided it's okay not to do that.
Is there a fertility technology that is both more successful and more ethical than IVF?
I think we don't know the answer to that question because most of the methods used for alternative means of dealing with infertility are not as well studied with IVF, but there is some early evidence that certain things with restorative reproductive medicine, interventions at the level of hormones and correcting endocrine problems, there are sometimes surgical interventions that can be done, have success rates that are as good or better than IVF. So, for example, a common cause of infertility is polycystic ovarian disease, and another common cause of infertility is uterine fibroids. And there are surgical interventions that can be done very often to correct these things without removing the ovaries, without removing the uterus, to try to actually restore reproductive functioning in those cases. It's not always possible to do those surgeries, and there are not necessarily a lot of specialists that do those surgeries, but the ones who do are reporting actually very good outcomes. So I think, again, this is an understudied, underappreciated, under-resourced area within medicine. But the pioneers that are out there and the data that I've seen recently from some of their clinics suggest that larger scale studies and more research on these interventions would suggest you could probably get outcomes that are as good, if not better, than IVF. The actual pregnancy rates with IVF are not very good. About 1/3, or even in some cases less than 1/3 of the IVF cycles that a woman has to go through will end up achieving pregnancies. And even after multiple cycles, some women spend tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of dollars on IVF and still don't manage to achieve pregnancy. So it's not the perfect solution.
I feel like what I keep seeing on social media are these women who are greenlit to go through multiple rounds of IVF. And then, after so many times, it comes out, oh, you have breast cancer or something like that. And I'm just confused. You would know more about this than me. But I just assumed that these fertility clinics, the IVF clinics, are doing all this testing to see, hey, is the reason you're not getting pregnant is because your body is going through some sort of other thing? How was she able to go through all these rounds of IVF and the whole time she had breast cancer, and that's why it wasn't working?
Well, sad to say, many reproductive endocrinologists, many of these specialists in infertility have become a kind of one-trick pony where IVF is simply their go-to. That is the foundation for the economic model for their practice.
But that just seems unethical. Shouldn't they be going through different testing to see if there's something else preventing pregnancy before telling someone to spend 15, 20, 30 grand?
You would think so. And that would be an much more ethical way to practice medicine. But unfortunately, in many cases, it's not. IVF becomes a kind of just knee-jerk, let's run a few basic lab tests, right, to see if there's some sort of obvious problem that would have an easy solution. And if we don't find something in that regard, we're just going to sort of run straight to IVF. And the fertility industry, and I think it's fair to call it that, the fertility industry, because it is an industry, it is a profit-driven industry, has in many cases abandoned good, what I call Hippocratic medicine, which is, let's do a thorough assessment. Let's, beginning with diet and exercise and self-directed natural interventions, correct all the problems that we can correct, then go to other interventions like drugs and surgery as necessary, when necessary, used judiciously to try to correct the underlying problem before we jump straight to something like this, which again doesn't actually correct or treat the underlying infertility. It simply doesn't end run around it by conceiving the child through other means.
What is RRM?
So restorative reproductive medicine is sort of an umbrella term to designate not one particular intervention, like IVF designates one particular intervention, but it's an umbrella term for basically a sort of disposition or philosophy of treating infertility that says we're going to dig into correcting the underlying cause. So
okay, so what we were just talking about.
what we were just talking about
my question is talking about the like a lot of these IVF clinics, they should really be looking into this first, and that there's ethical questions. Do you think that couples who have suffered through failed IVF cycles multiple times be able to sue IVF clinics who did not offer RRM?
You're gonna get me in trouble for this. Yeah, I mean, you could, anyone in this country can sue anyone else at any time. So certainly, I don't know if there are states whose malpractice lawsuits would capture that sort of scenario. Most states rely on a rather vague concept called the standard of care to define what would count as malpractice. And one of the problems right now is that in their defense, the IVF clinics would just come back and say, well, the standard of care in this situation is IVF. And by that, they mean what most other doctors around me are doing, right? So very often the standard of care is not defined by the best available evidence or actually the most effective medical intervention, but it's defined by a kind of consensus of what institutional medicine happens to be doing. And, without going too far down that rabbit hole, I think that's a problem with our legal definition. But if we could get the research, and if there were a sufficient number of clinics that were doing restorative reproductive medicine and showing that it was less invasive, as successful, if not more successful than IVF, and didn't come with the whole host of complicated ethical issues, some of which we've talked about, some of which we haven't covered, if that could be sort of demonstrated, then you would have a basis for going back to some of these clinics who are not offering that and saying, basically, this is a form of malpractice. But I think until we have that, you would have an uphill battle in the courts. But, there may be folks out there that want to road test some of those lawsuits and see how the court responds. But I think we're going to start seeing the growth of restorative reproductive medicine. There's a demand for it.
Well, and that's also, I know personally that is one of the focuses of the MAHA movement or coalition, that there are amazing people like midwife Lindsay Mealis and some others who are really, they've kind of been put in charge by Bobby Kennedy to really, let's look into infertility in this country. Let's look into what is causing PCOS, what is causing endometriosis, doing some studies and some testing and really putting the science to that so that hopefully there is more information so that people don't feel like their only option is big fertility industry, as I like to say. So if somebody were to go to you and say, doctor, I'm desperate. I want a child more than anything. I don't want to do IVF, but I don't know what my other options are. A personal friend, family member to you, what are you suggesting they do?
I will refer them to a local specialist who will try to practice restorative reproductive medicine. I'll give a shout out to my friend, Dr. Lauren Rubal. You should probably have her on the show to discuss these issues at some point. So she's very interesting. Lauren, at one point in her career, and she's talked about this publicly, practiced IVF. And then she basically got to the point where she said, morally, I don't want to do this anymore. She started seeing some of the ethical problems associated with it, and felt conflicted about it, and changed her practice, which is, serious kind of professional and financial risk for someone in that industry to start practicing. At the time, this term hadn't quite come into vogue, but essentially practicing restorative reproductive medicine. She's doing very good work, and there are others out there that, you mentioned a few of them that are doing very good work in this area. So that would be my first go-to.
And that's Dr. Lauren who?
Rubal.
And where is her practice?
Her practice is in Orange County, California, where I live.
All the good doctors are in Orange County.
Well, you got to come out and visit us.
Dr. Bob Sears. You've got Dr. Liaren Keneally. There's so many great people over there.
There are some great physicians around. Yeah, Dr. Sears is another friend. He's, he's been kind of practicing medicine according to this philosophy for many years. So yeah, there's good people out there. You just have to know where to look and how to find them.
Are only non-viable embryos what are being destroyed in the IVF process?
No. Many healthy, viable embryos are being destroyed in the IVF process. Probably more of those than embryos that would be considered unhealthy, or I don't like this term, quote unquote, defective in some way. So it's very important for people to realize that these are human lives that are just never given the opportunity to basically live a full human life.
Is there a concerted effort by American doctors to hide the scientific evidence that children born via IVF have a significant higher risk of health issues so that they do not jeopardize $1 billion industry?
I think there's a concerted effort simply not to look. There are multiple ways to hide things. One is to take evidence that already exists and bury it. We do have some evidence, and generally what's happened now is that evidence is either ignored or it's dismissed as inadequate. Okay, well, if you think the evidence is inadequate, at the very least, it's suggestive, right? One study in science never proves something. You always need multiple studies. You need replication. You need to look at, an issue from multiple angles. It's the cumulative weight of evidence that allows us to draw conclusions. So if your conclusion looking at the limited evidence now is that there's not enough evidence to actually prove these adverse health consequences, well, the sensible thing to do is to say, well, it's at the very least, at minimal, it's suggestive evidence, and we need to research it more. And so essentially what's happening is kind of a refusal to fund this research. And, there may be behind the scenes efforts to try to avoid allowing research that has been done in this regard to get published. I don't have specific examples of that to cite, but I can say that the peer review process of journal publication is sometimes let's say politicized, especially on a hot button.
To drag their feet?
Yeah, or to reject a perfectly sound paper on a pretense, to find fault with its methodology when in fact its methodology is good, and to, claim that you're rejecting it for this reason, whereas in fact you're really just rejecting it because you don't like its conclusions.
Probably happens a lot with
It happens a lot with it happens a lot with actually with many areas of medicine where the results would be inconvenient to a profitable industry.
It doesn't matter where you are in life. YWLS is for all women. Whether you're in high school, college, or in your 30s, 40s, or beyond, this summit is a place where women of all ages come together to learn, grow, and connect. In Dallas, June 13th through 15th, you'll be inspired by speakers like Ali Stuckey, Hilda Labrada Gore, myself, Ginny Urich from 1,000 Hours Outside, Riley Gaines, and more, as they share their insights and experiences. It's your chance to unite with like-minded women and be a part of a movement for truth and freedom. Use code ALEX at YWLS2025.com to get 25% off general admission. Each morning you stare into the mirror, painting on layers of makeup, chasing a perfection that leaves you feeling hollow. Society's whispers sting. You're not enough. When I discovered Adele Natural Cosmetics, a family pouring their heart into pure natural makeup products, that changed for me. Guided by faith, they believe beauty shines from within, like 1 Peter 3 promises. Their moisturizing foundation stick transforms me. It's creamy, it's got a blend of jojoba oil, cocoa butter, and raw coconut oil, offers coverage that hydrates, letting my true skin breathe free. Make sure that you get the Adele foundation brush to go with it. That makes a huge difference. I never, ever, ever apply liquid or cream foundation with just my bare hands. The Blue Lagoon face balm, laced with Blue Tansy's calming touch, soothes my dry skin and is the ultimate makeup prepper. Adele Natural Cosmetics says that you are beautiful the way you are. Let's enhance that and bring attention to the unique features that God gave you. Visit AdeleNaturalCosmetics.com. Use code ALEX for 25% off your first order. That's AdeleNaturalCosmetics.com with code ALEX and try completely clean, non-toxic makeup that actually works. All right, parents, here's the deal. We all know what spring means, right? It's not just sunshine and barbecues. It's the season where your kid turns into a sneezy, sniffling disaster. We've all been there. My friend's kid had allergies so bad last year, I thought we were going to have to put him in a bubble like a man-child. And of course, you rush to the store, you grab whatever over-the-counter allergy meds you see, and you think, okay, well, this is going to fix everything. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. The meds just turn them into a tired, groggy zombie, which is way more terrifying than the allergies themselves. But fear not, I've got the solution. Allertica. This is not some half-baked temporary fix that just masks the problem of allergies. This little miracle actually works with your kid's body to regulate histamine naturally. It's like giving your body a nice little, hey buddy, you got this, instead of just blocking stuff and hoping it all works out. Allertica is packed with natural ingredients like quercetin, stinging nettle, and rosemary. They're actually good for your kid, helping clear those sinuses and get rid of the stuffy nose without turning them into a sluggish zombie-like mess. Trust me, no parent wants their kid to be knocked out all day just to avoid a few sneezes. So skip the brain fog and go for the natural solution, Allertica. Go to Utz.com, that's UTZY.com. Use code ALEX for 20% off Allertica and get your family breathing easy this spring. It's time to stop relying on junk meds and give your kids something that actually works. That's Utz.com, UTZY.com, code ALEX for 20% off Allertica. What do you think of the executive order that President Trump signed expanding access to IVF?
I think it's a terrible idea. It's well-intentioned, the pro-natalist stance of this administration, the encouraging Americans to have more babies because we're below replacement levels that's a good thing. I'm very sympathetic to that. I think we are not having enough children for a healthy society, and a society that is at below replacement levels of birth rate is headed for economic and social disaster. You're not going to have enough young people to care for aging people. It's just one of the many problems that will be created by this demographic collapse. But we're never going to basically correct that deficit through assisted reproductive technologies. First of all, it's too cumbersome. It's too expensive. It doesn't work well enough. And I think if the administration wanted to put its energies toward encouraging people to have children, there's many, many better policy proposals.
What would you say if you could choose?
Well, make it easier for people financially to have children. I mean, you could tinker with the tax code in all kinds of interesting ways. Child tax credits, help with childcare. There's a lot of really sensible family policies that this administration could have gotten behind. My colleague at Ethics and Public Policy Center, Patrick Brown, and others have proposed many, many helpful family policies in that regard that could encourage people that want to have children but feel like they can't afford them to basically make it a little bit easier for them to afford children. Make birth free is one of the proposals that's been done in some European countries that could easily be done here at a fraction of the cost of paying for IVF, for example. And then putting money and research dollars towards restorative reproductive medicine, something that doesn't destroy human life in its earliest stage of development, that doesn't involve the creation and destruction of human embryos, which is going to be ethically controversial, and which, roughly half of Americans are going to have some sort of problem or reservation with. So I think the intention behind that executive order was good, but I think the particular means that it's encouraging is not the right way to go about solving, the problem of too few children.
I'm so curious, as a fun question. You're a doctor who has just been through the ringer legally. And if you had like 1 to 2 minutes in an elevator with Bobby Kennedy, what would you say to him about what you hope he is prioritizing and working on?
Bobby's a friend, so I have had minutes in the elevator
great.
with Bobby. And there's many policy proposals that he and I agree on. And one that was in the last chapter of my previous book, The New Abnormal, was basically direct-to-consumer advertising of pharmaceuticals. Mm-hmm. We are one of 2 countries in the world that permits that. New Zealand is the other country. People from anywhere else in the world look at, our commercials on TV, ask your doctor about Viagra or whatever, and they think this is totally insane. Why are we marketing pharmaceutical products directly to consumers when doctors are the gatekeepers for these drugs? This does a couple of things. One, I think it leads to overprescription and overmedication, and that leads to what's called iatrogenic harm, basically harm that's induced by medical interventions. That's a serious problem right now in the United States. But it also gives big pharma undue power and control over media companies.
Yeah.
Because when 75% of your advertising revenue at a major news network comes from big pharma, you're not going to run stories that are critical of that industry. And so it allows for the easy capture of basically the news media, then is hamstrung and unwilling to dig deep into the kinds of issues that you talk about, for example, on your show, which I assume is not sponsored by Pfizer.
It is not.
So that's one of the policies that I proposed a couple of years ago that I was happy to see Bobby take up. He's been talking about that recently. Removing liability protection for the manufacturers on is another really important policy. And we could go down a huge rabbit hole talking about. But look, if there's one policy that, again, I think people on both sides of debates should be able to agree on, I think one policy that would immediately improve safety is removing the liability protections.
Yeah.
Pharmaceutical companies actually know how to run good clinical trials. And when they're forced to do so, they will run good clinical safety trials. A company like Pfizer, not to pick on one company, any pharmaceutical company does not want another disaster like Vioxx. Vioxx was a drug that was given for rheumatoid arthritis that they buried some of the safety data or ignored some of the safety data in the clinical trials. Turns out later caused cardiac problems. They
Wow.
pulled it off the market. They paid tens of billions of dollars in fines and damages to that because they were liable for something that they could have and should have known that they chose to ignore. If something like that happens with a, and many people are arguing those kinds of things do happen with, but you're not allowed to sue the company, there's not that corrective mechanism. So the company is going to run sloppier clinical trials, not because they don't know how to run good clinical trials, but because they don't have to in this case.
Correct.
They can cut corners.
Why did Ronald Reagan make this a rule?
The lobby somehow convinced the administration and Congress at the time and President Reagan that would be insufficiently profitable if we did not do this, which I think is it's a completely insane notion. It's one of the most profitable industries. If you get on the CDC childhood schedule, you basically have a permanent cash cow for decades, for the life of the patent of that vaccine. So it was an ill-conceived policy to begin with. And if we corrected that, I think there would be immediate improvement. And basically the lawyers would take care of a lot of these issues. And this is a common mechanism of consumer protection. The example I like to use for people who are enthusiasts and don't think there's any problems here is, well, at least on this issue of liability. Let's suppose you were buying a car, and let's suppose Congress passed a law where car manufacturers, Toyota or Ford or whatever, were liable for the harms or the safety issues on all their cars except their minivans. You could sue them if the seatbelt malfunctioned or if the car blew up at a fender bender, but not for their minivans. Would you trust their minivan? Would you purchase that particular product from Toyota? No, you wouldn't. Does it automatically mean the minivans are unsafe? No, but just this is one of the things that increases our confidence that the company is going to act in a responsible way and not allow the profit motive, for example, or other motives to undermine making a good, safe product. So this just seems to me to be a sensible policy that the current administration really ought to enact.
What new fertility technology is coming down the pipeline that should absolutely disturb couples who are wanting to have a baby?
There's a new technology coming down the pike that should concern not just couples wanting to have babies, but should concern all of society because of its profound social implications. And that's the technology known as in vitro gametogenesis, which is a bit of a mouthful, IVG for short. So everyone's heard of IVF. Most people have not heard of IVG. IVG is sometimes referred to as artificial gametes. That's basically taking a cell in the body other than sperm or eggs, other than gamete cells, skin cells, for example, and genetically programming those cells so that they become gametes. So taking your skin cells and turning them into sperm, taking my skin cells and turning them into eggs. And I deliberately mixed up what you might expect there because you're a woman and I'm a man, but actually this technology could be used in that way so that, for example, it's being celebrated by many in the LGBT community because this could potentially allow two men to have a genetically related child or two women to have a genetically related child if you can create sperm from women or eggs from men. So that's one of the things that it's being proposed for. And by the way, I should note at the outset, this technology is not yet available in human beings, but there are researchers doing this in mice and in other mammals. So researchers have successfully created have successfully created eggs using this technology in mice, eggs that can be used in IVF for mice. So this is close to being available in other mammalian species, which means probably in principle, there's no reason why it won't be available for human beings, probably in the near-term future. So sober researchers doing work on IVG are saying, and I think not unreasonably, perhaps in the next 10 years, this could be available for use in human beings. So I mentioned the possibility of same-sex couples having a genetically related child, which would obviously create a new kind of human being that does not have a mother or does not have a father. And even children that are raised by same-sex couples now were obviously created by some other means, by IVF or through adoption. Every child living in the world now, every person living in the world now has a biological father and a biological mother. So what would it mean for our sense of lineage and identity and the relationship between generations to have a human being that did not have a mother, did not have
Just
a father biologically
created out of
speaking,
nothing.
created essentially out of two people of the same sex? It gets even weirder from there. So some advocates of IVG are proposing what they call multiplex parenting. Let's suppose you had 4 people that wanted to have a genetically related child of any combination of sex. Take 2 of that, take two of that 4, take their skin cells or take their gametes, create an embryo, take the other 2, create an embryo, extract embryonic stem cells from both of those 2 embryos using IVG, create sperm and eggs from those embryos, create yet a 3rd embryo, discarding the first 2 embryos, bring that 3rd embryo to birth. You have an embryo that's related genetically to all 4 of those original people. Technically, that embryo is the grandchild of those 4 people, but biologically speaking. But the child's parents were simply embryos that were created and destroyed in a laboratory. And in fact, you can run that cycle theoretically many times over, from embryo to embryonic stem cell to gamete to creating another embryo on down 4 or 5 times, then bringing that embryo to birth and creating a human being whose parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great, whatever, were all embryos that were created and destroyed in a laboratory, that they have no living, existing relatives who have lived a full, flourishing human life before conceiving them. So taking the generations and compressing them in space and time, if you will. And one of the problems with IVG is that we don't even have the categories, the language to begin thinking through the implications of what this means for the radical restructuring of family and familial ties, the relationship between generations, one's sense of identity. I mean, we're basically talking about a Promethean project of creating human beings in ways that I think we can't even begin to wrap our heads around the implications of this. And there's other weird scenarios that this would make possible as well. So, imagine the maid at the hotel where Brad Pitt is staying wants to have Brad Pitt's baby, but she fails to seduce him and have his baby in the old-fashioned way. No problem. After he checks out, she can just go to his pillow and scrape some of his skin cells off the pillow and bring it to a rogue IVG clinic and have his sperm made out of those skin cells.
That's like genetic theft.
So the possibility of this kind of genetic theft, the possibility of someone having a genetically related child out there that was conceived without their knowledge and consent.
That's disturbing.
Very disturbing.
And terrifying.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine, sorry, but even progressive leftists who would be all for, 2 men or 2 women having a baby this way, like Taylor Swift, for example. Taylor Swift, I am like her biggest fan, even though we see nowhere near eye to eye politically, okay?
I'm going to tell you a secret.
But
I like a lot of Taylor Swift's music too.
All the good ones do.
Don't tell my boys I said that.
All the good ones do. But this is exactly, she's so scared of stalkers and these different things. I totally could see her being like, this is now my new biggest fear.
Yeah,
is that
sure.
One of my crazy fans could, I write them a note or I shake their hand and then, they're getting skin cells and then they're creating children with my DNA. I feel like this technology, everyone would be lobbying for it and really all for it for the LGBT perspective.
Yes.
But then when you get into that part, I feel like we're going to hit some bumps, hopefully, from a legal standpoint.
I sure hope so. I mean, I would advocate for a total ban, a total moratorium on IVG, because I just don't think it's a project that's going to turn out well. But it will be sold even to conservatives who may have concerns about, same-sex parenting or generation of children, it's going to be sold with the wedge case, the heart-rending case of the woman with cancer,
Yeah.
whose ovaries were removed, and she's married in a stable family, and she's going to raise her kids with the values that you would raise your kids with, and wouldn't it be beautiful if she could have a child? And since she doesn't have any eggs left because of her cancer, we could just take some skin cells and create. So that's going to be the opening case. It's not going to be the LGBT case. It's not going to be the multiplex parenting case. It's not going to be the genetic theft possibility. It's going to be the case that everyone is going to have sympathy for.
From the medical world, you understand how this stuff works more. I mean, I don't. So like something like this, where we're in the beginning stages of just testing this on mice and all of that.
Yeah.
What is a realistic timeline? Like this is something like look for it in 40, 50 years, look for it as little as 10. I mean, how does it work?
I think it's very, very possible. You never have a crystal ball in science.
Sure.
And, prognostications about how long something is going to take are often very wrong. But I would say I would not be surprised if this was available in humans in the next 10 years.
Oh my gosh.
So it's not something it's not something way down the road. It's something that will be with us here soon. It's something that we need to start thinking about now, because there's some people working very, very hard at this. And people are publishing research articles on this in the medical literature and also in the bioethics literature. I mean, this multiplex parenting was published several years ago in a bioethics journal from people advocating that wouldn't this be a wonderful thing? This is something that's probably not too far around the corner.
Do you watch Severance?
I have not seen Severance. People keep recommending this show, so I need to see it. Yeah.
Well, it's going to be your number one favorite show, because this is literally the whole premise of the show is this type of stuff, because it's the bioethics of, well, wouldn't it be great if we could just create like this subset of human beings? It's like your mirror person, exactly, and they go to work for you and you don't. But the ethical thing, and in the show, there's like protesters of, should we allow severance in America? Should we not? Yeah. The problem is that this other human being, which is your counterpart that goes to work for you, they never leave the workplace. They are you, but they're trapped down here. And so they have dreams and hopes and aspirations of what is it like outside? I wonder what my real family is doing, what my real outer self is like as a husband, and do I have kids? Like they don't know anything about their outie, the person on the outside of work. And so it's this ethical issue of like, could we have this technology, we could create somebody, wouldn't it be great to be able to shut off and sever, your work issues versus your family issues and whatever. But what you're talking about so reminds me of that show, in that, we could create these types of human beings, but it's like, is it right? And the ethical issues of, if they are another human being, then don't they deserve like the full gamut of human rights? And, taking things from them like their lineage and knowing where you come from and having a biological mother and a biological father, like are all of these things human rights or are they not? Yeah. And I don't know, it just reminds me of that show.
Yeah, there's a principle in ethics that it sounds like very beautifully illustrated by this show, which is illustrated in terms of violating this principle, known as the personalist principle. And it goes back to a philosopher named Immanuel Kant. And one of the formulations is basically, you have to treat other people always as ends in themselves and never as a means to another end. So I talked earlier about instrumentalizing people. What does that mean? That means basically taking someone and using them for an extrinsic purpose. So I'm creating this human being to do the untidy or undesirable aspects of my life that I don't want to do. I'm instrumentalizing them, right? I'm not treating this person as an end in themselves with their own aspirations, hopes, dreams, dignity, freedom, hopefully, that the rest of us enjoy, but instead I'm creating them for this purpose. So, with ethical issues like cloning, it becomes clear that if we were to clone human beings, that would introduce certain expectations on those human beings simply because we created them to be like someone else, right? What do you mean you're not interested in playing basketball? You're a clone of LeBron James. That's the whole thing, was to get another really good basketball player out of this project. Well, I'm not interested in basketball. I'm interested in ballet, so leave me alone, right? That all of these assisted reproductive technologies that we've talked about so far, from IVF to IVG, have the very real potential and likelihood of leading us in that direction of basically instrumentalizing other people for our purposes rather than treating them as their own distinct individual with dignity that deserves respect, regard, the same freedom and rights as the rest of us.
You hold a lot of opinions that are really countercultural and controversial to most socially.
Really? I thought I figure everyone just thinks about these things in the way that I do.
But what you have on your side is truth, and that while it may be uncomfortable or inconvenient to hear the things that you've said today in this interview, the facts are on your side. So my question is for you from just a human perspective, especially for my listeners that really lack the courage or confidence to be able to share these views with friends and family members, even though they know that they agree with you. But they're like, I just can't tell my sister who did IVF that I feel this way, or I don't know how to explain, to my friends that even though I'm going through infertility, that I will not be pursuing those technologies to have a child. Like, where do you gain that confidence, and what encouragement or advice could you give them when faced with that situation?
Yeah. So, I mean, you can make me the bad guy and just send them this podcast. And say, hey, this is interesting. I don't know, tell me what you think of it.
I always tell them to like share.
Approach.
Well, I share this episode and don't even say that you agree. Just be like, wow, this was crazy. What do you guys think?
Yeah, exactly,
Like, don't even say anything.
You can always make me the bad guy. But I would say, these kinds of difficult conversations, try to begin with a point of understanding and agreement, right? Try to first find some common ground and help the other person feel understood. And then on the basis of that, maybe introduce something that might challenge the other person to think. So for example, with IVF is a really neuralgic issue, very difficult to talk about. But one common starting ground isn't new human life and wouldn't having a baby be a great thing? Yes, I totally agree with you on that. And isn't infertility a really painful and anguishing thing for people? And shouldn't we as a society be doing more to address that? Yeah, I'm totally with you on that. So maybe introduce where, I understand your reasons for this. I understand your intentions. I understand your motives. And I'm sympathetic to that.
Mm-hmm.
But now let's think about the means that we're using. Do you realize that in most cases of IVF, there are embryos that are put on cold storage or that are destroyed in the process? Have you looked at some of these complicated IVF cases where the disposition of these embryos creates difficult legal problems? Have you thought about this aspect of gestational surrogacy that maybe you hadn't considered before? So begin with common ground, and then if it's someone that you think is going to react really negatively, sometimes just asking a pointed question is better than making a strong and sort of overbearing claim.
Like put it on them to defend it.
Exactly. Well, what about this? Or have you considered that? For most people, a really thoughtful and incisive question might feel less threatening than I'm coming down hard with my conclusion, or sort of you're going to feel like I'm moralizing to you if I'm telling you don't do this thing that you want to do. So I'll be the first to acknowledge that these are difficult conversations, and it's easier for me to have a conversation with you about this if we have some common ground. But if there's a hostile interviewer in the room, I might approach this differently. I'd be maybe a little less strident in my conclusions. But at the same time, I think we don't want to be so careful, and so we want to be congenial, but we don't want to be so careful that we lack the daring to challenge some of these things. It is important also sometimes to take risks and tell the truth, even if the truth is inconvenient, even if it's going to cost you something, even if the other person might feel a little bit threatened by it. So you try to do that in a way that can be received by the other person. But also there are circumstances in which I think sometimes people are too timid and they back away. Just, I don't want to offend anyone, and I don't want to get on the wrong side of this person, so I'm not going to say anything. And, bad things happen when good people fail to speak out.
Yeah, we saw that in the pandemic.
Exactly.
And you spoke out.
I did, and it, I lost some friends, and it cost me my job at the university when I challenged their mandate in federal court, but I don't regret doing it. It was one of the best decisions I've ever made. And, there's nothing better than waking up in the morning with a clear conscience.
If you could offer one remedy to heal a sick culture, and that could be physically, emotionally, or spiritually, what would it be?
Well, we need to start connecting with one another face to face. There's a lot of loneliness in society. There's an epidemic of loneliness, and it has profoundly adverse consequences on us psychologically, spiritually, and physically. The health consequences of loneliness are very profound, comparable to smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day on things like heart disease and cancer. So we need to get away from our screens and start connecting with one another face to face in real communities of people encountering. I love that we're doing this interview in person. It's so much better than
so much better,
on
right?
a screen. So yeah, thank you for flying me up to Phoenix here
Yes.
to be with you. It's a little less convenient, but it's a lot more engaging and real. So that is one piece of advice. Get away from your screens and connect with real people in face-to-face encounters. And I think we're a culture that has lost touch with God. So we need to reconnect with God through prayer as well. People have a hard time being in silence. We're surrounded by noise. And so spending some time every day in silence, in contemplation, away from the devices and away from the noise and away from the things plugged into our ears, I think is also important for psychological and physical and spiritual health and sanity.
Where can people follow you on social media?
So I'm on X, Aaron Kheriaty, MD. I am on Substack. I have a Substack called Human Flourishing that I post regularly, once or twice a week. To that, my articles and my interviews are all found there. AaronKheriaty.com is a website that I have that has prior interviews and articles as well.
And where you can buy your books?
Yeah, you can buy my books too. So I'll plug the books. The last book was called The New Abnormal, and it was about some of the things that were rolled out during COVID. And more importantly, it's not so much a retrospective on the pandemic, but how those things are going to be used in the future to undermine our civil liberties. And my next book is on contemporary healthcare and medical education. It'll be out in September. It's called Making the Cut. So I don't think it's available yet for pre-order, but probably in a couple of months.
Well, Dr. Kheriaty, this was one of my most favorite interviews of the year. So thank you so
Alex.
much for coming on Culture Apothecary.
I enjoyed it.
Not to toot my own horn, but tutor. That was a groundbreaking, phenomenal episode. If I do have to say so myself, I couldn't stop thinking about this for days afterwards. I just loved this conversation. I'd love to have Dr. Aaron back because, I don't know, it's just fun for me to get to interview people who are so smart, way smarter than me on these topics. And I knew how I felt about certain reproductive technologies and, different services or whatever that are available to people that are wanting to become parents. But hearing the way he puts it, just from an evidence science-based backing, was so helpful for me to hear. If you enjoyed this show, even if you hate this episode because you disagree, leave a 5-star review. Say that you appreciate us having different points of view to kind of help challenge you and learn something new. We are on a mission to heal a sick culture twice a week. I'm Alex Clark, and this is Culture Apothecary.